Something I've been thinking about a lot is that it really feels like 2024, even more so than 2023, is just kind of this endless series of questions about LLMs that kind of show up at any moment. I think yesterday I had a meeting with the CEO and a few of the product teams, and one of the slides was like, hey, we can use like GPT-4o, which has a 32,000 token context window, or like the OpenAI Agents API, which has our Assistants API, which has a 40 million token context window. And it's like trying to think, how do I explain that these are two entirely different things? Like one's like actually like RAG pretending to be a context window, and the other is actually a context window. And how do I do it really quickly before my CEO gets so excited about our ability to perfectly analyze 40 million tokens in a couple of seconds? And I think that's kind of the ongoing experience, right? If you're actually trying to navigate companies, like sometimes you get to make the decisions, but sometimes you're also trying to help explain to the folks around you how to think about these things. And one of the biggest challenges that the folks around us, I think, are through like great intent, coming up with like very alluring but like inaccurate mental models of how to think about LLMs. And we have to figure out how to do a little bit of a better job of helping them find mental models that actually work versus mental models where we have to kind of fix things later when we realize that they don't work because we know looking at them that they're not going to work ahead of time. So the first kind of mental model that I think probably all of you have seen a lot is there's a lot of people who want to believe that LLMs are genuinely magic. They're not a technique, but they're something that you just install and they solve problems. Like the engineers are complaining about not getting like a large enough raise, like just replace them with LLMs. The CX team's not fast enough, just replace them with LLMs. And this is like appealing if you have problems, but it's not like helpful because you can't actually narrow the problem space down to things where this is a useful technique. Another one that I get that's a little bit like trickier is a lot of folks that are not quite in engineering but are adjacent to engineering have been working with kind of more classic reinforcement models for a long time. And so they see like mediocre performance in a use case with LLMs. They're like, oh, no problem. Like we're just going to add more data and the accuracy is going to go up a bunch really quickly. And so they see these like initial results not as a demo that's the best possible case because you're like secretly like finding only the use case that might work. Instead, they look at the demo as like the worst possible case. Like, hey, when you add more data in, this is going to get a lot easier. And these mental models are starting to show up everywhere. And I think the most enjoyable one, of course, like you go into the board meeting and you have to explain why your LLM strategy is insufficient to the board. They have a lot of LLM companies they've invested in that they want you to adopt. So they need you to start using this. Of course, like every day you wake up, you get like 15 new emails from vendors. You don't know exactly what the vendor does, but they are using LLMs to do it, which is very important to you, they hope. And of course, like online, like people are telling you that you're like a complete idiot because you've actually hired engineers. Like you don't even need this anymore. Like LLMs are going to do that for you going forward. And it's hard when you're in this hype cycle to figure out like what's real. Because I think there is a real transformational change happening out here in terms of how products are being built and what they're capable of. But also, there's a lot of lies. And how do you navigate that? And so I want to talk a little bit about 8 pillars for kind of thinking about LLMs in a useful way. How has Carta applied these pillars in some of our product development that's kind of live in production today? And then like a few random thoughts after that. First, there's 2 different categories to think about in terms of like rolling out LLMs. And the first 2 are basically like tool adoption. These are important, and they're important to all of us. But I don't have anything to say about these. Like you think about like tools to like empower engineers, like Copilot, et cetera. These are great. Like just try one. The fact that they're using LLMs or not actually doesn't matter to you, right? It's just like you have a problem. These help you actually accomplish the problem you're trying to solve. And there's also tools that apply not to just engineers, but to kind of everyone at the company as well. And again, great. Just try something. The LLM piece is just like magic dust they're trying to sell you. It doesn't matter if there's LLMs there or not. What really matters is like what can the tool help you do. What I want to talk about is third category, which is like how do you actually change your product? How do you actually change like what you're doing for your customer in an interesting way? 8 useful pillars. The first one, LLMs will give you a response to anything. Even really useless questions. If you mentor folks, you probably get questions like this, and sometimes it feels like my CEO wakes up on a daily basis and asks himself, like, could this be a good day for a reorg? And that question, like, if you don't know, like, that's like not a very helpful question. And the challenge is an LLM will dutifully answer that question, which is a terrible question. And so this is the first kind of like major thing to remember is that you like ask stupid questions, win stupid prizes. And if you don't control the questions that are going in, you're going to get very silly answers. The second one is you never know for a new question whether you're getting a hallucination or not. So the very first time that I tried to use ChatGPT a while back now, my wife, who's a software engineer, was asking, like, how do I figure out if a given metric in Graphite is happening during working hours or not? And I'm like, I have no idea, but I bet ChatGPT can answer this. And it did. It was like, just use the is working hours function, and it will tell you. And it had like really comprehensive documentation, was really thorough, and it looked really good. But of course, this like didn't exist at all. It was hallucination, right? Tried this again a little bit later. This isn't a hallucination, but I would call this like a filibuster, where it in no way ever attempts to actually answer the question, but it keeps giving like related-ish context, and it kept going on for pages and pages, where you kind of think it's going to answer the question at some point, but at no point does it ever answer the actual question being asked. And there's no way to know ahead of time for a new question whether it's going to be accurate or not, and this is, again, the second kind of key thing to think about for LLMs. Third, product workflows matter like a tremendous amount. I think matter more than we think they do so far. So imagine you're building like a mortgage application online. Your users log in, they type in some random information about their taxes, their earnings, their current net worth, whatever. And then you have someone internally that verifies and asks for documents to help verify that. Like that's basically, if you've applied for a mortgage in the last like decade, that's basically how it works. You like do a lot of jotting numbers in, and someone yells at you that you have a typo somewhere. But with LLMs, you can kind of invert the workflow, right? Like what if instead of people having to like spend all their time typing, what if you ask for the documents right up front, then you can extract all the data, and all of a sudden you've elevated from your customer from like someone who types a lot and gets sad to someone who verifies the information that's been pulled out. And then you get to elevate your people internally from someone who like has to extract all this data as well to someone who can just use, like kind of statistics-driven kind of error or like risk detection, plus looking at where the customer overrode the model on extraction. And they're able to do like a much narrower job. And this is how we go from a place where your customer is kind of like just doing manual work to the LLMs doing manual work. The customer's reviewing the work of that so that they get to have input to make overrides if there's an error, but they don't have to do anything boring. And also your internal folks who kind of were previously having to like pull this data out, do this comparison, now it helps focus them on the most interesting problems to solve. I think like a lot of applications, there's going to be something like this where you have to really shift the model of how it works. If you're not shifting the model for how your application works to take advantage of LLMs, like my guess is you're not going to get a lot of leverage out of LLMs and keep thinking that just isn't possible, but I think it is. More on this later. You can get a good accuracy, or you can estimate accuracy for LLMs by using evals. So coming from the OpenAI evals kind of library on GitHub, here's an example. Basically like unit tests, right? But you can have for like say a prompt trying to generate a SQL example or SQL query from like a human language example. You can test to see how does it perform as different models, as models evolve over time, including kind of like transparently evolving underneath the hood in ways that you wouldn't even know about necessarily as the vendors shift what's out there. You can keep running evals to understand like how's the quality changing over time. It allows you to experiment with kind of different prompts as well. Evals, I think, core part of actually doing these in production. Models generally get more accurate as they get larger. So this is the Hugging Face kind of arena. So the fitness score here is kind of the arena ELO. You can see larger models generally performing a little bit better. But although they get more accurate, they also get more expensive and slower. You can see, ChatGPT 4 about 10x more expensive than 3.5 Turbo. Even the fastest LLMs just aren't that fast. And so you can see that the best in class here are kind of 5 to 7 seconds. But it's a little bit more nuanced than that, right? So thinking about like a real workflow, the size of your context window is going to radically change like how long it takes to respond. So if you're using a larger context window, it might be 30 seconds instead of 5, even for like a fast model. And then you think about a real workflow, like typically you have to start, or often, certainly in Carta's case, you're starting with like PDFs. So you have to use something like AWS text extract to get the actual data out before we can start running the model against it. So that's another 30 seconds. And then what we find is that like often like you ask once, you get like a partial answer. You actually have to ask 2 or 3 times to get the full set of answers that we're trying to get out of the model. So often you see a chart like this, it's like, hey, the P50 is 5 seconds. These things are incredibly fast. But the real models that we're using in production to look at the entire workflow, still taking us 2 to 5 minutes to actually do typical workflows. So this is where we have to look at not just the kind of the first number, which is like 5 seconds isn't that slow, not that fast, not that slow. But if you look at the full sequence of things you need to do to actually deliver something useful to your customer, it can be significantly slower than that. And then I think for B2B companies, you're charging like $20,000, $30,000 a year for 10,000 customers. Like LLMs are pretty cheap. If you look at our OpenAI contract we have right now, it's like actually like relatively hard for us to use the entire commitment we've made. It's just like not that expensive for us for what we're doing. Consumer apps, on the other hand, are way more expensive. And of course, you have like different ways to play with this. You can self-host different models like Llama, et cetera. But still, I think there's going to be like an interesting moment now when it's going to be really easy for folks doing B2B stuff to experiment, to get a lot of value. A lot harder for folks doing consumer work. A little bit about how Carta's adopted LLMs. So first, people think a lot about model adoption. How do we get the right model? How do we do something smart? We just did like the simplest possible thing. We signed a contract with one of the 2 big providers, and we just started there. We tested a little bit between models, but that's a late stage decision. You can just pick the different ones. We didn't worry about it. We did something simple and got started. The second thing we started doing is we inverted all of our workflows. So the typical way that Carta's workflows used to work, very similar to the mortgage example above, is like we would get your documents last. So like type this stuff in, and then at the end, we wanted to get some documents to actually review. We inverted it. So for essentially every one of our product workflows now, the very first thing that happens is we get your documents. And this is really powerful because it's allowed us to decouple the machine learning engineering teams that are working on the actual extraction work from the product engineering teams that need to change the workflows. You try to do this in one step. It's actually really hard to like schedule both of those teams at the same time and to make all the workflow changes. Instead, we're able to make all the product changes in terms of shifting the workflows, pulling the steps up at once without the ML engineering teams involved at all, and then design a workflow where they come in and gradually enhance over time. So the typical way that our experiences work, you come in, first step, we ask for certain documents. Then immediately in the background, we start extracting kind of information from those documents after we classify the document to understand the type. Typically, folks don't have all their documents ready, so they come in, they add a couple documents, then they have to go search their email, their box or whatever to find the other documents. We get to kind of invisibly take advantage of that time. So these models, again, can be pretty slow, text extract plus multiple sequences of actually running these API calls. But we're doing that immediately once they upload the first document for that document and so on. So it can still feel really snappy for them because it's taking them a while to actually find the documents they need. And so slow, objectively, from clock time, but from the perception of the user, like instant. And so figuring out how to play with those. And I really want to emphasize, like the most important part of this was decoupling the machine learning engineering teams from the product engineering teams so the MLE teams can iterate in peace and they can keep improving. And then as more data gets exposed, we just have that pre-populate forms down steps. And again, human in the loop built in because we have these forms. Now instead of typing it in, the values pre-populate, but people can override it if something is wrong. And so they still have the ability to validate as we improve the quality. 2 different ways to think about humans in the loop. I think Carta, again, has like a lot of interesting advantages here. First, if you think about a new fund coming onto Carta for us to administer their fund, they upload documents, but then we have like internal fund controllers that would actually review the information getting extracted from it. So we have like built-in human in the loop. Also, for some of our cap table sides, like typically the person actually uploading your cap table is like a paralegal at your law firm. And so these people are like incredible experts. They know more about cap tables than any of us will ever know in our entire lives combined in aggregate. Because that's what they do. They spend a lot of their time like uploading cap tables and managing it. So the first way we started rolling out this like drop your docs feature was we rolled it out to paralegals. And so what are the problems for paralegals? Like paralegals, unlike lawyers, paralegals typically don't bill by the hour. They're more, they have like services that are kind of like guaranteed to the funds they support. So the law firms don't care as much if they have like an efficient time or a good time. They just make them grind through tasks. So like how do we like save time for the paralegals so it's easier for them to actually get work done? So they just care about efficiency, they care about doing it quickly, and they care about accuracy. So we built a tool that solved a problem for them, but also took advantage of their presence because we can use them as a human in the loop to verify the information getting pulled out. So kind of win-win for everyone there. But then, human in the loop's great, and I'll talk a little bit more about why it's great in a bit. But human in the loop is a little bit constraining, right? If you actually want to do something quickly, but you want to do something quickly with a user who doesn't understand the data very well, like they can't verify. And so you think about Cart-to-Launch. So Cart-to-Launch is basically our free cap table product. If you're a small company that hasn't raised a priced round, you can Cart-to-Launch for free with your cap table, et cetera. But if you're a brand new founder, you probably know about your product space really well. You probably know a little bit about building something. You probably understand effectively nothing about cap tables because you're an entrepreneur trying to build something. You don't know cap tables at all. So showing the cap table to the founder may or may not actually be helpful in terms of getting useful feedback from them at that early stage when they're just getting started. So they're not the perfect human in the loop. But this is a case where the problem is so constrained, you haven't raised a single price round, so it's probably just the founders, maybe a couple of safes, something like that on the cap table. So it's simple enough that we can actually use kind of software in the loop, or no one in the loop other than kind of some stats-based analysis, and get it right anyway. Even if we happen to get it wrong, which we don't, really the time when accuracy matters the most is when you do your first price raise. So it doesn't matter too much up to that point. It still needs to be accurate, but if you make a mistake, you have a moment. So instead of in the process, the actual workflow, having a human in the loop, still have humans in the loop before this kind of moment in time when a priced round would occur. Once we had that set up, where we kind of were capturing the documents early and decouple the ML teams out, they've just been able to iterate. So they've been fully decoupled from product engineering, and they're just adding document type by document type. They're just revving kind of in the background, improving the quality of some of the documents we're already working with, and expanding coverage there. And as we expand that team, we get faster working across all the different models or all the different documents we're working with. Again, we don't have to go back and reprioritize the product engineering team to do it, fully decoupled. And then finally, one thing that's been, I think, really powerful about this is that the product's actually getting better for the customers directly, but we don't have to talk to them about the LLMs. We don't have to sell them about the technology. We just solve a problem that they have. They're happy about that. For the paralegals, they don't care that we're using LLMs. That's not that interesting to them. They care that this task that was taking them hours, super nitpicky and error-prone, now mostly just works with a little bit of review from them. I'm going faster than anticipated. This is great. So I have 9 kind of random thoughts to share that I've kind of called corollaries because it makes me sound official. OK, first, I think a lot of the hype around LLMs right now is that they're really good at going from 0 to 1. And it turns out going from 0 to 1 is relatively easy from a software design perspective. And this is why the venture capital industry relies on new founders to do this. This is why what we worry about most is people who look for reasons it could go wrong, rather than people that know the challenges they're going to run into. This isn't this is a place where the risk is not trying something. The risk is not you don't scale it efficiently enough. And LLMs are going to be really great at this. Where they're going to be absolutely terrible is when you have compliance obligations, when you need to respond to an audit request, when you need to complete your SOC 2 on an annual basis, when you need to actually migrate real customer data, where even if you do it right, you can still do it right and so slow that it's a problem, right? And so this is where I think we see a little bit of the tension and the reasoning about the promise of LLMs. If you have no customers, you have no data, you have no legal obligations, and you have no compliance risks, they're pretty good. But once you start having a real business, all those things aren't things you can just ignore. They're actually the hardest part of running the business, right? And so this is where I think we're going to see this kind of split where early stage things are going to take huge advantage of LLMs. Later stage things, not so much. I mean, I've definitely worked at companies where really smart people tried to do a Postgres migration that brought down the site for several hours. And so you could argue hey, if smart people can do it, it's fine if LLMs make the same mistakes. First, people have a different tolerance for automation making mistakes than they do for humans. It's OK if Sarah makes a mistake, but not if GPT 4.0 makes a mistake. But second, the humans also avoid a lot of the mistakes that could happen. Second, people talk about hallucinations when it's about like, oh, it's about like making errors and detecting errors or not. A lot of hallucinations at scale are more about like shifting legal liability away from you to an individual. And I think any discussion at scale for a real business that doesn't talk about like manipulating and like shifting the legal liability is sort of missing the point. It's not just about errors, it's about the consequence of the errors once you have something that's worth protecting. Human in the loop, only solution that really works for accuracy. Also software in the loop for sufficiently constrained problem spaces where we can actually reason about it predictably. A lot of the early ideas around LLMs are kind of about like how do we reduce costs? You know, replace the engineers, replace the customer success, replace the executives, like whatever the highest efficiency opportunity is for your company. But I think like when we're judged by history, like we're going to be judged not for like we didn't cut costs fast enough with LLMs, which is probably like the least interesting thing we could be spending our time on. But instead, like how do we actually create like net new experiences? When our current companies get outcompeted by the next generation of companies, it's not going to be because they like didn't hire engineers or they saved money on like support costs. It's going to be because they built like net new novel experiences that do things our experiences can't, because they've designed experiences that take advantage of LLMs in ways that we've designed experiences that really struggle to do so. And so if you're getting pushed to focus on kind of these like tactical fixes that can improve like costs, sure. I mean, if you're not talking about costs, you haven't been to a board meeting. But if you're only thinking about costs, like I don't think you're going to actually get that much value here. Like no one's going to fire you. It's like reduce costs with LLM. That's like the bare minimum to keep your job as an executive in 2024. But I think that's like not really accomplishing that much. It's not changing the trajectory. I think there's a desire to kind of believe that we've seen the majority of the wins in terms of like improvement in larger models. Who knows? But I think it's pretty unlikely. So, there's a thesis that we're going to run out of data to train models. Like, I don't think people are super worried about running out of data yet. There's another thesis that we're going to run out of money to train, like for compute to train the larger models. The latest generation of models, like $500 million to $1 billion to train, probably not going to get massively more. At some point, I think this becomes like a national security issue in terms of like which countries are willing to invest more money, right? But the bigger thing is like there's just like a ton of like algorithmic investment we can do that will reduce the complexity, reduce the computation, reduce the required data sizes to get comparable results. It's not going to be one thing that's going to cut it in a tenth or a hundredth. But there's still a lot of algorithmic improvement to be done here. I think it's like unlikely that you can bet on improvements not happening at a similar rate for at least a few more years. So think about that. Like what if we get 2 more years of this rate of improvement? Like what's that going to look like? I think it will be like pretty different than it is today. RAG, context windows. I think a debate for the ages, no doubt. But just try both. See what works. I think for a lot of cases, context windows demo really well because you get it done. But then as they get larger, they just don't perform the way a user would expect them to. And so this is one of those cases where it might be, expanding context windows are the right technique for kind of demoing, prototyping, but kind of the wrong technique for things in production. And this sort of ties into like one of my pet peeves, which is like a lot of companies are just reinventing search with LLMs. But we can do better than just like reinventing search with LLMs. That's not that interesting. If your feature is just search pretending to be LLMs, keep trying. In-context learning. So in-context learning is like before we had the example of the evals. In-context learning is like what if you took the evals and put them in the prompt themselves, which helps give context to the prompt about what sort of answers you're looking for, like how they should reason about it. Surprisingly effective technique. Also a good example of places where interfaces that actually like have humans like write prompts are really hard to get good performance out of them because like typically you can get significantly improved performance through ICL. We are for our work use cases, but you can never have a human like actually like go like write the ICL examples like consistently. And so I think the performance of experiences where humans write these things versus like you generate and have a constrained experience that generates the results are going to be radically different. Chat is not the right interface for the future. I think this is second to last one. I think Again, something we want to be true is that machine learning engineers are sort of like old, like we don't have to hire them, they cost too much, they complain about data quality, like, ugh, this is such a pain. And we're just gonna get these like amazing people who don't complain about things and just generate results. But that's not really my experience. I think again, like one of the curses of LLMs is it's like such a powerful demo technology, or if you get the right prompts for the model you have, you can show like a perfectly compelling demo. And then your CEO is like, build it. And you're like, uh-oh. They're like, actually, there's like nothing I can take from this demo to actually implement it. It's like totally different approach and technique. And so for all the models we're actually using in production, first, none of them are just like, write the prompt and you're done. Like for all of them, it's been significant iteration. For all of them, we have to use things like ICL to actually get the quality that we want. For all of them, the data that was going in, sometimes easy data problems, like still encoding, like are you still dealing with like poorly encoded text in 2024? Like yes, like you're still dealing with poorly encoded text in 2024. But a lot of these things are like the core kind of competencies of data science MLE teams. And if you think that you can replace it with someone who doesn't have any of the background, again, for the 0 to 1, you can. But again, going from 1 to n, when you have legal liability, you can't. Yeah, I sort of made this point 3 or 4 times, but just start with a simple model. I think there's a lot of like discourse on like picking the right model, but if you're trying things, if you're getting started, I think the least important thing to worry about is picking the right model. Pick anything, learn how to iterate, and then like optimize model selection over time. I think one of the fortunate things is like no matter what the right model is today, it's the wrong model in like 6 to 12 months. So even if you get it right, like the advantage of getting it right is like pretty time boxed.